The German sergeant was checking his watch when 200 shells landed at once. There was no warning, no distant rumble of guns, no whistle of incoming shells. 1 second, his men were eating cold rations in their foxholes outside St. Lo. The next second, the earth erupted in every direction simultaneously. Men who had been standing vanished. Vehicles flipped into the air. The concussion wave knocked soldiers unconscious 50 meters from the nearest impact. The survivors who crawled out of the craters weren't just wounded. They were psychologically shattered. In the span of a single heartbeat, their entire reality had changed. There was no buildup, no fighting chance. German artillery didn't work like this. Nobody's artillery worked like this. They had just experienced something the American Army had been perfecting for a decade. A weapon so devastating that German generals would later say it was worse than anything else they faced in the war, including the tanks, including the bombers, including the Russians. To understand why American artillery terrified the Germans, you have to understand how artillery normally worked. Traditional bombardments started with ranging shots. A battery would fire 1 or 2 shells, observers would watch where they landed, and gunners would adjust their aim. Then the real barrage would begin. This process took time. More importantly, it gave the enemy warning. The first shells told defenders exactly what was coming. They had precious seconds to dive into foxholes, crawl under vehicles, or flatten themselves against the earth. And those seconds mattered more than anyone realized. The U.S. Army conducted studies on how fast soldiers could react to incoming fire. At the moment of first impact, 58% of soldiers in a defensive position were still standing. Only 9% were fully prone with protection. But within 2 seconds of the first explosion, the numbers reversed. After 8 seconds, every single soldier was flat on the ground with some form of cover. The mathematics were brutal. A bombardment that gave defenders 8 seconds of warning was 66% less lethal than one that arrived without warning. The question that consumed American artillery officers in the 1930s was simple. What if there was no warning at all? The answer came from the windswept hills of Oklahoma. Fort Sill had been the home of American artillery training since 1911. In the years between the world wars, while the rest of the Army stagnated, a handful of officers at Fort Sill were quietly revolutionizing how artillery could be used. Major Carlos Brewer arrived at the gunnery department in the late 1920s with radical ideas. He believed American artillery was too slow, too cumbersome, too dependent on outdated methods from the First World War. Brewer introduced new fire direction techniques designed to make artillery support almost instantaneous. His successor, Major Orlando Ward, took the concept further. Ward created something called the Fire Direction Center. Instead of each battery calculating its own firing solutions independently, a central headquarters would coordinate all the guns in a sector simultaneously. The implications were revolutionary. If one headquarters controlled dozens of guns, and if the calculations could be done fast enough, every gun could fire at a different time, but have all their shells land on the same target at the same moment. No ranging shots, no adjustment fire, no warning. The Germans had never seen anything like it. Neither had anyone else. The concept was elegant. The execution was murderously complex. Every artillery shell follows a ballistic arc. A 105-millimeter howitzer 3 miles from the target might have a flight time of 45 seconds. A 155-millimeter gun 5 miles away might take 60 seconds. A distant 8-inch howitzer could take 90 seconds or more. Time on target, the soldiers called it TOT, required calculating the exact flight time from every gun position to the target. Then each battery would fire at precisely the right moment, so all shells arrived within a 3-second window. The countdown went out over radio. Fire direction centers broadcast the time hack to every battery in the sector. Gunners listened with stopwatches. At the designated moment, the distant heavy guns fired first. Seconds later, the medium batteries opened up. Finally, the closest guns added their shells to the converging storm. The target heard nothing until impact. For a German soldier, it was inexplicable. You hear a bird chirping, you hear the wind, and then, in a fraction of a second, everything explodes at once. American officers quickly learned the psychological effect was as devastating as the physical destruction. German prisoners consistently reported the same thing. The silence before a TOT barrage was the most terrifying part. The Germans could do the math. Any competent artilleryman understood ballistic calculations. What they couldn't match was the speed. Under the German system, an attack from an unexpected direction could expect to be free from accurate artillery fire for 10 to 12 minutes. That was how long it took German batteries to receive targeting information, calculate firing solutions, and adjust their guns. American artillery could respond in under 3 minutes. The difference came from technology and doctrine working together. General Jacob Devers, a pioneer of armored warfare, had studied the FM radios that Connecticut State Police used in their patrol cars. He convinced the Army to develop FM vehicle radios for forward observers. The result was clear communication from the front lines to the fire direction centers, even while units were moving. German forward observers had to rely on telephone lines that were constantly being cut by shell fire. American observers rode with the infantry, calling in coordinates by radio in real time. By 1944, an American infantry company under attack could have artillery support within 3 minutes of the first shot. The Germans needed 12 minutes for the same response. Those 9 extra minutes cost thousands of German lives. The gap between American and German artillery wasn't just about tactics. It was a clash between 2 different centuries. While American batteries hummed with the sound of diesel engines and radios, the German artillery columns still clattered with the sound of horses' hooves. They were fighting a modern war with Napoleonic logistics. Worse, German forces were using captured equipment from every nation they had conquered. General Hans Eberbach, commanding 5th Panzer Army in Normandy, wrote that his artillery included guns from every major power in Europe. French 75s, Czech howitzers, Polish field guns, Soviet pieces captured on the Eastern Front. Each gun required different ammunition, different firing tables, different maintenance procedures. The logistics were a nightmare. Some batteries couldn't fire at all because the correct shells hadn't arrived. The Americans, by contrast, fielded a standardized family of guns with abundant ammunition and pre-computed firing solutions for every situation. At Normandy, the British alone had 6 times as many guns as Eberbach could deploy. The Americans had even more. German officers understood they were outgunned. What they didn't understand, not until they experienced it, was how completely the Americans had mastered the science of coordinated fire. The American artillery system received its first combat test in North Africa in late 1942. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was impressed despite himself. In a letter to his wife dated February 18, 1943, he described the fighting during the initial clashes in Tunisia. An observation plane had directed the fire of numerous batteries on all worthwhile targets throughout the zone, Rommel wrote. The Americans were calling in accurate fire faster than his own forces could respond. The Desert Fox had fought the British for 2 years. He knew what Allied artillery could do, but the American system was something different. It wasn't just volume of fire, though the Americans certainly had that. It was the coordination, multiple batteries converging on single targets with precision timing. The American forces at Kasserine were green. They made mistakes. Some units broke under German attack. But the artillery never failed them. Even when infantry positions were overrun, the guns kept firing. German advances stalled under curtains of steel that seemed to appear from nowhere. Rommel's veterans noticed. They started respecting American artillery long before they respected American infantry. By June 1944, the American artillery system had been refined into a killing machine. The Normandy hedgerows should have been a defensive paradise for the Germans. Each field was surrounded by earthen berms topped with dense vegetation. Perfect cover for defenders, perfect death traps for attackers. American infantry struggled in the bocage. Tanks couldn't break through the hedgerows. Progress was measured in yards per day, paid for in blood. But the artillery never stopped learning. Forward observers developed techniques for calling fire onto positions they couldn't directly see. Spotter planes circled overhead, directing batteries onto German concentrations. At Hill 192 outside St. Lo, the 2nd Infantry Division faced entrenched German defenders who had repulsed every attack. The division artillery commander tried something new. He coordinated 20 separate TOT missions in a single night. Every few hours, German positions that seemed safe erupted in simultaneous explosions. The defenders couldn't sleep. They couldn't resupply. They couldn't rotate their exhausted men to rear positions because the rear positions were getting hit too. By morning, German resistance had crumbled. The psychological effect had been as important as the casualties. On July 25, 1944, the American Army demonstrated what happened when air power and artillery worked together in perfect coordination. Operation Cobra was designed to break the Normandy stalemate. General Omar Bradley wanted overwhelming force concentrated on a narrow front. The bombardment began at 9:38 in the morning. Over 1,500 heavy bombers dropped their loads on German positions west of St. Lo. Medium bombers followed, then fighter bombers. Finally, as the smoke cleared, the artillery took over to pin down any survivors. More than 1,100 guns opened fire. Over 140,000 shells had been allocated for 7th Corps alone. The Germans holding that sector ceased to exist as a fighting force. General Fritz Bayerlein commanded the elite Panzerlehr Division, one of the best armored units in the German army. His men were veterans of the Eastern Front. They had survived Soviet artillery barrages and British bombing raids. Nothing had prepared them for this. Bayerlein's after-action report described the combined devastation of the air power and artillery in language that shocked even hardened staff officers. The bomb carpets rolled toward them, most passing only a few yards away, he wrote. A pall of dust rose with fountains of earth spewing high in the air. The whole area looked like a moonscape. Everything was burned and destroyed. His tanks were overturned. His communication lines were severed. His command posts were demolished. But the physical destruction wasn't what broke his men. It was the helplessness. The survivors behaved like lunatics, Bayerlein reported. They were found shaking uncontrollably, unable to speak or hold a weapon. In my opinion, hell is not as bad as what we experienced. A German general who had fought across Europe for 5 years wasn't comparing the battle to the Russian front. He was comparing it to damnation. The Panzerlehr Division, the elite armored formation that had been expected to throw the Americans back into the sea, lost nearly half its combat strength in a single morning, and Operation Cobra was just the beginning. The German line didn't just bend at Cobra, it shattered. American armor poured through the gap. Within days, General Patton's Third Army was racing across France, covering distances that seemed impossible. German units trying to retreat found themselves under constant artillery harassment. American forward observers rode with the lead elements, calling in fire on any concentration of enemy troops or vehicles. The advance was so fast that artillery battalions had to leapfrog positions just to keep up, but the fire direction system was designed for exactly this kind of chaos. Batteries could displace, set up, and register new firing solutions within minutes. German defenders trying to establish blocking positions discovered that American shells arrived before they could dig in. The artillery seemed to be everywhere at once. By August, the German army in France was in full retreat. Entire divisions were destroyed in the Falaise pocket, caught in a crossfire of artillery from multiple directions. The survivors carried stories back to Germany. American guns fired without warning, and the shells arrived from nowhere. In December 1944, American artillery became even more terrifying. The proximity fuse, soldiers called it the funny fuse, or the VT fuse, had been one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. The Pentagon had refused to allow its use in ground combat for fear the Germans might recover an unexploded shell and reverse engineer the technology. But when Germany launched its desperate offensive in the Ardennes, General Eisenhower demanded permission to use every weapon available. The VT fuse contained a tiny radar transmitter. Instead of exploding on impact, the shell detonated automatically when it sensed it was close to the ground, typically 20 to 50 feet in the air. An airburst shell was devastating against troops in the open. Shrapnel rained down from above, penetrating foxholes and trenches that would have protected against ground-level explosions. Combined with TOT tactics, the proximity fuse turned American artillery into something almost supernatural. German soldiers who thought they were safe in their fighting positions suddenly found death falling from the sky with no warning at all. The Battle of the Bulge became the ultimate test of American artillery. On December 16, 1944, over 200,000 German troops smashed into weakly held American positions in the Ardennes forest. The attack achieved complete surprise. German armor penetrated deep into Allied lines, but the artillery held. At Dom-Butgenbach, on the northern shoulder of the Bulge, German forces were breaking through. The 2nd Infantry Division faced annihilation. American artillery came to the rescue with well-placed targeting of over 10,000 rounds in an 8-hour period. For the frozen, terrified American GIs huddling in their foxholes, that distant thunder wasn't just noise, it was the sound of salvation, the only thing standing between them and a massacre. The German advance stopped cold. On the northern shoulder, 4 American divisions coordinated their artillery under a single command. 348 guns plus a battalion of 4.2-inch mortars all fired together, their shells directed by one fire direction center. Units that had successfully broken through American infantry positions found themselves shredded by converging artillery fire. And then the proximity fuses arrived. General George Patton was not easily impressed by weapons. He believed in aggressive tactics and mobile warfare, not sitting back and letting artillery do the work. The proximity fuse changed his mind. In a letter to the War Department, Patton described what happened when his guns caught a German battalion in the open. "The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating," Patton wrote. "We caught a German battalion attempting to cross the Sauer River and killed by actual count 702. Actual count, not an estimate. After the smoke cleared, soldiers had to walk the field and count the bodies one by one. A single artillery concentration had wiped out an entire German battalion, over 700 men killed in minutes." Patton continued his letter with an observation that revealed how much the new weapon had impressed him. "I think that when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare. Coming from Patton, who believed in charging forward, not waiting for technology, this was extraordinary praise. He concluded simply, "I am glad that you all thought of it first." The psychological effect of VT-fused TOT barrages pushed German soldiers past their breaking point. At Malmedy, American artillery battalions supporting the town fired proximity-fused shells against attacking German formations. The defenders watched in disbelief at what happened next. German soldiers charged directly into the artillery fire, screaming "Kamerad," the German word for surrender. Think about the level of terror required to make a soldier run toward the enemy. It wasn't a tactical decision. It was primal panic, a desperate need to be anywhere else but under those airbursts. When interrogators asked survivors of the Bulge what they feared most, the answer was consistent. It wasn't the bitter cold. It wasn't Patton's tanks. It was the airbursts. After the war, American intelligence officers systematically interviewed German commanders about their experiences. The testimony was consistent. German officers who had been critical of American infantry, calling them enthusiastic amateurs who relied too heavily on firepower, had nothing but respect for American artillery. The German perspective revealed something important. When German units came under attack, the British would return fire and maneuver to a better position. The Americans responded differently. Instead of maneuvering, they simply smothered the area with a punishing rain of steel. Once the barrage ended, they counterattacked before the Germans could even lift their heads. This pattern of immediate, overwhelming violence shattered German defensive doctrine. They were trained to absorb an initial assault and then counterattack. American artillery denied them the opportunity. One captured German officer summarized the difference. He noted that the British would fire, then pause to adjust. The Americans, he complained, simply fired everyone, everything, and all at once. By March 1945, American artillery had achieved something unprecedented in military history. At the Rhine crossing, Generals Simpson and Eisenhower stood on the West Bank and watched 2,070 guns open fire simultaneously. Over 60,000 shells in a single hour, the largest TOT barrage of the war. The German positions on the far bank didn't just take casualties. They ceased to exist. When the smoke cleared, American infantry crossed with minimal opposition. The defenders who survived were too stunned to fight. Patton later wrote in his memoirs that the artillery had won the war. The time-on-target technique didn't win the war by itself. No single weapon ever does. But it represented something important about how the American military approached warfare. While other armies relied on courage and tactics, American officers at Fort Sill spent the interwar years solving problems with mathematics and engineering. They asked a simple question: how do we kill more of the enemy while losing fewer of our own men? The answer was coordination, speed, and overwhelming firepower delivered with precision timing. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't make for heroic stories of individual courage. But it worked. German soldiers who faced American artillery in France, Belgium, and Germany carried the memory for the rest of their lives. The silence before the storm. The instant when the world exploded. The helplessness of knowing that nothing they did could protect them. General Bayerlein spoke for all of them. Hell is not as bad as what we experienced. The men who perfected TOT at Fort Sill never became famous. They fought their war with slide rules and stopwatches, years before the first shot was fired. They weren't looking for glory. They were looking for a way to bring American boys home. And the soldiers who survived because of their work knew exactly who had saved them.